The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms came into operation in 1921. In the provincial field, they erected the system of diarchy, i.e. the division of powers between responsible ministers and the irresponsible executive councillors. Some subjects were made popular and given into the charge of popularly elected ministers who were responsible to the provincial legislatures, and some subjects were reserved to the governor, who administered them through appointed executive councillors, who were not accountable to the provincial assemblies. The idea was to train Indian politicians in representative government before trusting them with full powers in all fields. The Simon Commission. The essentially transitional character of the 1919 reforms was so well known to the Indian leaders that they began to clamor for the next installment of reforms even before diarchy had worked for a year. The 1919 Constitution has stipulated that after 10 years, the government would again go into the question of constitutional progress. The terms of reference of this inquiry were to investigate the working of the system of government, the growth of education, and the development of representative institutions. It was finally to report on the extent to which it was desirable to establish the principle of representative government, or to extend, modify, or restrict the degree of responsible government already in existence. But the Indian demand for a revision of the Constitution became so insistent that in 1927 the Government of India Act of 1919 was amended so as to enable the government to hold a fresh inquiry before the expiry of the 10-year period. Accordingly, on 26 November 1927, the appointment of a statutory commission was announced, with Sir John Simon as chairman. The commission was charged with the duty of investigating the Indian constitutional problem in all its implications and to draw up recommendations for future action. In India, the appointment of this body was received with acute disappointment because it contained no Indian on its panel. Indian critics of its personnel took it as a slight on their ability that an all-British body would determine their future. What they forgot was that in the first place it was a parliamentary commission appointed by Parliament and required to report back to Parliament. And in the second place, that Indian disunity practically excluded the possibility of any two Indians agreeing on their recommendations. Indian participation in the commission would have created serious problems. Was it to contain some Indians or more Indians than British? Were all Indians parties to be represented on it, or only the major ones? And in what proportion? Would the Indian members reach unanimous conclusions? Would their recommendation be acceptable to Parliament or even to all Indians? The Indian Legislative Assembly resolved by a majority of 6 votes to boycott the commission, while the Indian Council of State decided to cooperate. The Congress was uncompromisingly opposed to it and called for a complete boycott. Small minorities favored cooperation. Muslims were split. One section led by Sir Muhammad Shafi proclaimed support, while the other led by Jinnah shared the Congress view. In spite of the Manchester Guardian's appeal not to class the British investigators among the untouchables but to admit them to society and to attend to their education, the Congress and the Jinnah League persisted in their opposition. The non-cooperating Muslims got a good press, as non-cooperators always did, but it is wrong to think that they represented a majority of the Muslims. Exact figures are not available, but it is safe to say that the Muslims were almost equally divided between the cooperators and the non-cooperators. The arguments of the non-cooperators were the same as the Congress. India was not represented on the commission. This was a deliberate insult. Britain had no right to impose a constitution on India through the recommendations of an all-white investigating body. Britain had not heeded the Congress League scheme of 1970 and would again disregard whatever the Indians proposed. Anyway, there was no point in negotiating with unsympathetic, arrogant, reactionary rulers. The cooperators had different views. They pointed out that many Hindus expressed their disapproval of the Lucknow Pact. The Congress now was in principle once again opposed to separate electorates and was carrying on an energetic propaganda to this effect in Britain. It was therefore all the more important that they acquainted the Commission of their stand. Communal representation was essential to Indian order and progress. The Hindus could not be trusted to the extent of surrendering the safeguard of separate electorates. Hindu domination was a real danger, and Muslim security could only be assured by cooperating with the British and putting their views before the Commission. The Nehru Report. In his speech in the House of Lords announcing the appointment of the Statutory Commission, Lord Birkenhead, the Secretary of State for India, had explained why no Indian had been put on the panel, and had asserted that no unanimous report could be expected from a body with Indian representation. A Hindu report or a Muslim report or a Sikh report was possible, but not an Indian report. This was resented by the Congress leaders, who immediately decided to draft a constitution to confound the India office. An all parties conference had already been convened to bring together all the non-cooperating groups. Now this conference appointed a committee to draw up a constitution for a free India. Motilal Nehru presided over these deliberations and gave his name to the committee as well as to the report. There were two Muslims among its 7 members, Ali Imam and Shoaib Qureshi. Both were unrepresentative of their community and had long ago been repudiated by the great majority of the Muslims. Shortly afterwards, the Sikh member of the committee was disowned by the Sikh League. The Indian Christian Conference also disassociated itself from the principles adopted by the report on the protection of minorities. The Nehru Report, published in August 1928, made the Hindu-Muslim rift final and irrevocable. It recommended a fully responsible system of government in which the majority would be sovereign. Muslim electorates were to be immediately abolished. Muslims were shocked into unity. Members of the central and provincial assemblies found it impossible to agree with the report. The Aga Khan doubted if any serious-minded person could imagine the Muslims accepting such degrading proposals. The United Provinces All Parties Muslim Conference repudiated the Muslim members of the committee. In March 1929, the two groups into which the Muslim League had been split came together in opposition to the report. When on 12 March 1929 the report was debated in the Indian Legislative Assembly, all the Muslim members, including Jinnah, who had sided with the Congress in boycotting the Simon Commission, rejected it in such strong terms that the Times correspondent reported, "The solidity of Muslim feeling in the Assembly was not unexpected, but certainly disturbing to those trying to represent the Nehru Report as a demand of a united India. Henceforth such a claim must be manifestly absurd." On the other side, the Congress made the rift irrevocable by not only adopting the report in its entirety and congratulating the committee on their patriotism and their far-sightedness, but also by giving notice that if the British government did not accept it by December 1929, the Congress would launch a non-cooperation movement. There is little doubt that the Nehru Report conferred the real power upon the Hindu majority and envisaged a Hindu Raj. At least that was the impression it conveyed to the Muslim mind. The Lucknow Pact had been forgotten. The good old days of the Khilafat were fled, never to return. The unity of the Congress League scheme was buried deep under the debris of communal riots. Gandhi's emphasis on Hindu-Muslim unity sounded unreal in juxtaposition to his ultimatum to Britain that the non-implementation of the report would lead to chaos. The fundamental Muslim demand for separate representation, conceded in 1909 by the British and in 1916 by the Hindus, was rejected by the report and by the Congress in unqualified terms. The Muslims were completely disillusioned, and from 1928 onwards, the Congress became all but in name a Hindu body. The Muslims would henceforth look upon it as the arch enemy of their claims and interests. In retrospect, it is now apparent that the Nehru Report was a blessing in disguise to Muslim nationalism. It united the Muslims as nothing else could have done at that time. All political differences and personal rivalries were hushed. From this moment onwards, there was nothing that could be called Indian nationalism. A separate Muslim national feeling had by now grown almost to maturity, though it was not given a name for another 10 years. The coming of federation. In the meantime, the Statutory Commission had finished its labors, and the Simon Report was finally published in May 1930. The first volume surveyed the entire Indian problem, and the second, published after an interval of a fortnight, set forth the Commission's recommendations for a constitutional advance. Historians have lavished much praise on Simon's handiwork, and though sometimes overrated, it is certainly an impressive treatment of an exceedingly complicated problem. In the fullness of its study, the depth of some of its observation observations, the lucidity of its argument, the realism and reasonableness of its approach, it is a commendable essay at constitution making. Few white papers have surpassed it in comprehensiveness. Authority and practicability in the first volume may be found one of the most ably reasoned refutations of the claim that India was a nation in the sense in which France or Sweden were nations. The publication of the Simon Report was followed by 3 roundtable conferences convened in London by the British government to determine the contents of the future constitution on the basis of the report's proposals. The first met in the winter of 1930-31. The Congress was absent because it insisted that the conference must not discuss whether India should or should not receive responsible self-government, but must shape a constitution on the assumed basis of a free India. All other parties attended and the Aga Khan was elected the head of the total Indian delegation. Most of the work was done through the Federal Structures Subcommittee, and gradually the federal plan took shape and substance. Muslims went away from the first conference with the impression that the British government was more interested in Hindu aspirations than in Muslim apprehensions, and that insufficient attention had been paid to their wishes and to their power to make these wishes effective. Ramsay MacDonald's speech at the close of the session, delivered on 19 January 1931, was particularly resented by them as a tactless slight upon their community. They took exception to the Prime Minister's remark that the question of Muslim safeguards was the kind of thing which had better be settled by the Hindus and Muslims together. Such attempts had not taken anyone far in the last quarter of a century. In the last resort, the British government would have to intervene to settle and to stand by some allocation of power and representation between the two peoples. Muslims were reluctant to make material reductions in their demands in order to support the Hindus in their demand of home rule, because they believed that the real aim of the old orthodox Hinduism was to gain full mastery of the new India. The absence of the Congress had given an air of unreality to the proceedings of the first conference, and early in 1931, the Labour Secretary of State asked the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, to open peace negotiations with the Congress leaders. This was done in February, and in March the so-called Gandhi-Irwin Pact was signed, which smoothed the way to Congress entry in the second conference. The second conference opened in the autumn of 1931. The communal issue was seriously tackled, and the Aga Khan, acting as a spokesman of all the minorities, negotiated with Gandhi. But Gandhi, the sole Congress delegate to the conference, refused to consider any compromise until the Muslims accepted the Nehru Report in its totality. Upon this, all the minorities, except the Sikhs, drafted a joint demand of claims and presented it to the British government as their irreducible minimum. This was not only a bill of minority rights, but also furnished the Prime Minister and his colleagues with an extremely valuable guidance for their own future procedure if the settlement of the outstanding principles between the Hindu minority and 5 out of 6 chief minorities was to be left in their hands. Muslim demands at the conference were based on the resolutions passed by the All India Muslim Conference at Delhi on 4 and 5 April 1931. In summary, they were residual powers with the provinces, separation of Sindh from Bombay, full autonomy for the Northwest Frontier Province, reforms in Balochistan, transfer of power direct to the provinces, separate electorates to special Muslim weightage in all political bodies, constitutional section for the enforcement of basic rights, safeguards against communal legislation, adequate Muslim representation in ministries, proportionate representation in public services, and amendment of the constitution. Only with the concurrence of the provinces, the real significance of these demands must be realized. The aim was to gain complete control over North and Northwest India, and then to feel secure and confident that the Muslims' culture and religion would develop and expand, and that he would protect the scattered minorities of his co-religionists. In other parts of India, read with Sir Muhammad Iqbal's address to the Muslim League in December 1930, this interpretation of Muslim demands came very near to the heart of the matter. Muslim nationalism was coming to the point of demanding a territory for its consummation. However, the second conference ended at a dismal note. No agreement was reached on the Hindu-Muslim issue, and it was clear to all that the British government would have to assume the difficult task of arbitration. There were 3 obvious reasons for the government to give the final verdict. First, they were morally bound to attempt by unilateral action to resolve the deadlock. Secondly, they were politically committed to see that the process of transfer of power was not arrested by communal bitterness. Thirdly, they were bound by the explicit warning of the Prime Minister himself given on 1 December 1931 that in case of a deadlock, the government would have to give its own award. The fact was that it was impossible to make any progress in constitution making without first determining the proportion of Hindu and Muslim shares in the proposed legislatures. The last and the least important conference was held in November to December 1933. The Congress was again absent, and most Indians had by now lost all interest in the London deliberations. The broad lines of the coming constitution were now common knowledge, and only details remained to be filled in. The results of the long labors of the three conferences were collected, sifted, and summarized in a white paper issued in March 1933. It faithfully translated the measure of agreement reached at the conferences. But the chief Muslim objection was that it created a strong center. The Muslims urged that the provinces should be granted maximum fiscal, administrative, and legislative autonomy. Further, they demanded a slightly increased proportion of the British Indian seats in the federal upper chamber over the one-third they had originally asked for, as no effective means were available for securing the necessary seats among the states to make up the proportion. They also wanted the provincial governments to control the public services adequately. A joint committee of both houses of parliament was appointed to consider the white paper. Constitutionally, this body was exclusively composed of members of parliament, but 20 representative Indians from British India and 7 from the states were appointed as assessors to the committee. The 5 Muslim co-optees were the Aga Khan, Sir Zafrullah Khan, Sir Abdur Rahman, Sir Shafad Ahmad Khan, and Sir A.H. Ghaznavi. The committee was at work from April 1933 to November 1934 and finally reported to Parliament on 22 November 1934. The report was debated in the House of Commons on 10 to 12 December 1934 and in the House of Lords on 18 December. The second reading took place in February 1935, and after the third reading in India, bill finally reached the statute book on 24 July 1935. Never before had the British Parliament taken so long and worked so hard on a colonial constitution. Never before had India figured so prominently and so consistently in Hansard. Never again was Britain to lavish so much care and ability on India. For those who had a hand in the making of the 1935 reforms, it must have been heart-rending to see in later years their handiwork torn to pieces in India and the pieces cruelly thrown into their faces. History provides no instance of a constitution prepared so studiously and tried so partially and perfunctorily. The federation set up by the Act of 1935 was the closer rather than the looser type. Hindu Unitarianism had prevailed, particularly in the composition of the federal legislature. The Muslims objected to it because to them a strong center meant an increase of Hindu strength. They were also opposed to the central government having the power of interference in the criminal administration of the provinces, as this would have enabled a Congress cabinet in the center to paralyze the administration of a Muslim province. The Muslim League found the federal scheme to be fundamentally bad, most reactionary, retrograde, injurious and fatal, and rejected it. However, it undertook to work the provincial part of the constitution for what it is worth. The Congress turned down both the parts of the act but decided to contest elections and to wreck the constitution from the inside. Elections to provincial assemblies were held early in 1937 and the Congress won majorities in 8 provinces. But it refused to form governments unless the safeguards incorporated in the Act were suspended and the governors undertook not to interfere with provincial administrations. This started a controversy as to whether the Congress was or was not justified in making this demand, and as to how far the governors were right in refusing to exercise the responsibility placed on them by the provisions of the Constitution and by the instrument of instructions issued to them on their appointment. For our purpose, this controversy, though one formally between the Congress and the government, has much significance, partly because the Muslims had accepted the 1935 Act only because it contained certain safeguards, and partly because this demand made them suspicious that the Congress wanted to impose a Hindu Raj on India without any constitutional restrictions. On its freedom of action already in March 1937, Edward Thompson, who knew the Congress mind well, had predicted that the Congress would work the constitution so that when in the summer of 1939 Germany declared war and Britain withdrew her forces from India, it could take charge of the whole country. This demand was not received kindly by either the Muslims or the British. The Congress was repudiating the authority of the Parliament and jeopardizing the whole edifice of the Constitution. Its demand amounted to the plea that the governors should bargain away the powers with which they had been explicitly entrusted against the contingency of political defeat. The minorities, and especially the Muslims, had accepted the constitution only on the strength of these safeguards, and to demand their scrapping at the very opening of the new regime would only increase their apprehensions. Pure democracy postulated that minorities bowed to the will of the majority because they had faith in its moderation. As this postulate was absent in India, these powers had been given to the governors to protect the minorities from oppressive majorities. As Hindus were in a majority in most provinces, it was natural that they disliked the safeguards. It was equally natural for the Muslims to insist on them, as they formed a minority in most provinces. No governor could lawfully contract himself out of statutory provisions. The demand was thus unconstitutional. The reserved powers were an integral part of the constitution and could not be abrogated except by Parliament itself. The governors could not treat the Congress as a privileged body exempt from the provisions by which all other parties were bound. The precautions so carefully inserted were not meaningless formalities which could be tossed aside under pressure. The Muslim ministries of the Punjab and Bengal had not made any such demand. Why should the Congress be made an exception? A little later, however, the controversy was silenced by a statement of the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, assuring the Congress that the governors would not use their special powers unnecessarily. The Congress accepted this assurance and took office, but the fact that such a demand had been formulated and pressed by the Congress was to the Muslims full of omen. Already at the Round Table Conference, they had been alarmed by Gandhi's insistence on the Nehru Report. The Congress' attitude to the communal award was another straw in the wind. Now the demand for doing away with the safeguards was indicative of the Congress' growing ambition to rule India on the principle of majority rule without its essential ingredient of the voluntary acquiescence of minorities. The advent of the Congress to power opened a new chapter in modern Indian history in more ways than one. For the first time, responsible governments were installed in the provinces. For the first time, the Congress tasted the heady wine of power. And for the first time, the Muslims realized that what this meant to them. Some salient features of Congress rule must be mentioned here. One was that the Congress ministries were accountable not to the legislatures which had elected them or to the electorates which had given them the mandate, but to the high command of the party. Strict control was exercised, and even in minor matters, ministers were obliged to take orders from the Congress committee. This rigid application of party discipline was aimed at maintaining at all costs unity of the Hindu nationalist movement. Some likened it to the Nazi machine in Germany and noted how provincial assemblies wilted under local bosses at parliament in Europe wilted before a Nazi protector, though the Congress leaders justified this innovation on the ground that the Congress was a nationalist movement fighting for freedom rather than an ordinary political party forming a government, yet this practice was certainly at a variance with democratic principles. The first two attempts to apply British parliamentary democracy to India at once produced a system which was not recognizably British. What is even more important, this practice was not in accordance with the underlying assumptions of the 1935 Constitution, which had envisaged provincial autonomy as a training ground for self-government rather than as a testing ground for nationalist totalitarianism. Another feature was the Congress' refusal to share power with the Muslims. The Muslim League and the Congress manifestos issued for the 1936-7 elections were so close to each other that most observers looked forward to cooperative coalition ministries. But the Congress was not prepared to abandon its claim to speak for the whole of India and insisted that the handful of its Muslim members were the only authentic representatives of Muslim India. When the Muslims asked for coalitions, the Congress refused unless the Muslim League merged itself in the Congress machine and ceased to exist as an independent body. Muslims were quick to recognize the extent and depth of the Hindu hostility, and each atrocity perpetrated by Congress administrations was recorded, verified and published. Sir Reginald Coupland admitted that there was some truth in these charges, and in the 1939 The Times India correspondent reported that authority in the United Provinces was disintegrating, that law and order were not being maintained, that administration of justice was being tampered with, that the services and police were losing confidence, that agrarian discontent was spreading widely, and that communalism was more rampant than ever. Petty Congress officials were interfering with the police, and the government had issued a circular asking the district authority to consult local Congress leaders. A shocking example of Hindu intolerance was given by Sir Michael O'Dwyer when he quoted a directive issued by the Congress chairman of a local board in the central provinces to the headmasters of all Urdu schools, which were attended by Muslim boys, to order the students to worship Gandhi's portrait. In short, there was every sign that the new constitution signified a Hindu Raj, pure and simple. By now, it is a commonplace to connect the Congress rule with the emergence of the idea of Pakistan. Such an authority as a former Secretary of State for India, L.S. Emery, believed that it was the conduct of the Congress ministries that had driven the Muslims to separation. What the Congress rule had taught the Muslims without a shadow of doubt was that administrative guarantees, the governance instruments of instructions and constitutional safeguards were not effective protection against the coming of a Hindu Raj in which they would be relegated the unenviable position of a permanent minority. One historian of Indian nationalism has concluded that the unexpected accession to power had warped the judgment of Hindu leaders, but this observation does not take into account the fact that the Congress' ambition to rule over India single-handed was at least as old as the Nehru report, if not older, and till his death, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru justified his 1937 decision to refuse coalition with the Muslim League anyway. The Congress' rejection of the idea of cooperative living with the Muslims was a fatal mistake which wrecked all chances of a united India, practically ensured a partition on religious lines. Muslim reaction to the end of Congress rule was indicative of their feeling of extreme disquiet. When the Congress ministries resigned en bloc in October 1939, Jinnah called upon his people to observe a deliverance day on 22 December to mark the end of tyranny and oppression. This day was widely celebrated not only by the Muslims but also by the Hindus and Parsis, who were displeased with the way the Congress had used its power. Christians and hundreds of thousands of untouchables joined in the demonstrations. This showed most clearly the depth of communal feeling, and even those who termed it an unwise action which postponed the hopes of India's attainment of full nationhood conceded that it was a retort invited by the action of the Congress itself. The Congress had been voicing a new demand since 1934. This was for the establishment of a constituent assembly elected by Indians to determine and draft the future constitution of the country. Obviously, such a body would be predominantly Hindu and therefore incapable of safeguarding Muslim interests. The Muslims were not prepared to see the communal problem solved on a simple majority basis, and the idea of an assembly amounted to just this. No such proposal could be contemplated unless the Congress had rid itself of its fastest aspiration to dominate India. The significance of the Congress demand was that it would have given the Hindu majority the power to impose a constitution on the minorities. What the Hindu leaders did not realize was that any imposition of a constitution that was not voluntarily accepted by the Muslims would lead to disruption and an irretrievable split in the country. But such considerations did not weigh with the Congress, which continued to pass a resolution pressing this demand at every annual session. Thus, by the end of 1939, it was widely believed that if the Congress government had lasted much longer, communal fighting would have broken out on an unprecedented scale. The idea of a civil war had been an almost inconceivable idea so long as British rule was still unquestioned, but now many Indians were saying that it was coming towards separation. As was said above, the Muslim reaction to Congress may be said to have led directly to the idea of Pakistan. The more the Congress insisted on a strong center and a constituent assembly, the more it raised Muslim apprehensions. In 1935-7, Jinnah had opposed the 1935 constitution because it did not concede responsible government at the center. After the experience of Congress rule in the provinces, he had to revise his views. Provincial autonomy was a substantial concession towards responsible government, and he had seen how the Congress had used this power. If similar responsibility was extended to the center, Congress rule over the whole of India would be unavoidable, and a Congress-dominated central government would nullify the autonomy of Muslim provinces. What was the remedy? A very weak center might have satisfied the Muslims, but the Congress was adamant on a strong federal government. In the face of these possibilities, the Muslims refused to have any center at all. If the Hindus wanted to have a strong center, let them have it, but then let the Muslims have their own separate center. This was partition. The Muslim replied to Hindu Unitarianism. This was Pakistan. The Muslim retort to Hindu hegemony. It was in December 1930 that Sir Muhammad Iqbal, the poet, delivered his presidential address to the Muslim League annual session in Allahabad. In this speech, he said that the principle of European democracy could not be applied to India. Communalism was indispensable to the formation of a harmonious whole in a country like India. The Muslims of India were the only Indian people who could fitly be described as a nation in the modern sense of the word. And then he came to the famous sentence which has earned him the title of the father of the Pakistan idea. I would like to see the Punjab, northwest frontier province, Sindh and Balochistan amalgamated into a single state, self-government within the British Empire or without the British Empire. The formation of a consolidated northwest Indian Muslims state appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims, at least of northwest India. It must be remembered that Iqbal did not argue for a Muslim state but only for a Muslim bloc in an Indian federation. Moreover, Bengal and Assam did not enter into his calculations. It is grossly misleading to call him the originator of the idea of Pakistan or the poet who dreamed of partition. He never talked of partition, and his ideal was that of a getting together of the Muslim provinces in the northwest so as to bargain more advantageously with the projected Hindu center. It is one of the myths of Pakistani nationalism to saddle Iqbal with the parentage of Pakistan. In 1932-3, during the sittings of the Round Table Conferences and the Joint Committee on Indian Constitutional Reform, a group of Muslim students in England were evolving another scheme for India, led by Chaudhry Ahmad Ali, a Punjabi studying at Cambridge. They formed the Pakistan National Movement, which issued its first pamphlet on Pakistan in 1933, entitled Now or Never. The essence of the plan was the formation of an independent Muslim state comprising the Punjab, the northwest frontier province, Kashmir, Sindh and Balochistan, in complete independence of the rest of the India and in close alliance with the Muslim states of the Middle East. The word Pakistan, coined by Rahmat Ali himself, was formed from the initials of the component units: P for Punjab, A for Afghan province, northwest frontier province, K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, and Tan for Balochistan, and meant literally the land of the pure. Iqbal's idea of a Muslim federation within a larger Indian federation might or might not have inspired Rahmat Ali, but the latter was at pain to emphasize that his scheme was essentially different from Iqbal's, since it involved the creation of an entirely separate Muslim Indian federation. It is interesting to recall that when the Muslim League representatives appeared to give evidence before the Joint Committee and were asked if any such scheme existed, they vehemently denied that any responsible Muslim had put forward such a plan, and in so far as the League had considered it, they thought the idea was chimerical and impracticable. India itself, the Pakistan idea did not make any progress at all until after the Muslims had gone through the crisis of Congress rule. In 1938-9, three other schemes appeared, each trying in its own way to appease the demands of Muslim nationalism. Abdul Latif of Hyderabad presented his zonal scheme. Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, the Punjab Premier, proposed the division of India into 7 regional zones, and a Punjabi advocated the formation of 5 regional federations. None of these favored a complete separation between the Muslim and non-Muslim areas. None of these plans, however, met the approval of the Muslim League or captured the imagination of the Muslim masses. The partition of India, clean and complete, was officially adopted for the first time in March 1940. When the Muslim League, fresh from its freedom from the Congress rule, met in its annual session at Lahore and passed the famous Lahore or Pakistan resolution of 24 March, after reiterating that the scheme of federation embodied in the 1935 Act was totally unsuited to and unworkable in the peculiar conditions of this country and is altogether unacceptable to Muslim India, and that the constitutional plan should be reconsidered de novo. The following important paragraph summarizes the Pakistan demand. Resolved that it is the considered view of this session of the All India Muslim League that no constitutional plan would be workable in this country or acceptable to the Muslims unless it is designed on the following basic principles, viz. That geographically contiguous units are demarcated into regions which should be so constituted with such territorial readjustments as may be necessary that the areas in which the Muslims are numerically in a majority, as in northwest and eastern zones of India, should be grouped to constitute independent states, in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. At long last, the Muslims had taken the final plunge and committed themselves to complete separation. Muslim nationalism had come to full maturity and now demanded a territory of its own. But to imagine that Muslims had never thought, however vaguely, of having a state of their own before 1940 is to misread Indian history. For at least 15 years prior to the Lahore Resolution, the notion, however nebulous, of a separate Muslim bloc or alliance or federation had been present in the minds of men. A remarkably large number of British students of Indian affairs noticed these rumblings and recorded them for us, starting from 1925 and working down to 1939. We find a long line of such observers pointing to the coming of Pakistan. In July 1925, William Archbold, one-time principal of the MAO College Aligarh, foresaw a powerful Muhammadan combination in the northwest in alliance with Afghanistan. In March 1928, the Times correspondent in India reported a vision of effective Muslim rule in North India and prophesied a division of the Punjab and the creation of a solid Muslim bloc from Peshawar to the mouth of the Indus. His own comments on this were, "It does not seem logical, however, or compatible with our avowed intentions towards India to discountenance out of hand a plan which is constructive and contains many elements of a practicable structure." In December 1928, the Empire Review favorably considered the suggestion of breaking up Indian provinces into small units in accordance with ethnic and local sentiment, and thus to allay communal fears. The implication was that at some future date it might be practicable or necessary to merge the Muslim and Hindu areas into some sort of separate blocks. In March 1931, the Round Table thought it certainly possible that India might break up first into a Muslim and a Hindu India and later into a number of national states, as Europe did after the Renaissance and the Reformation. In June, Sir Theodore Morrison, a former principal of the Aligarh College, declared that Hindus and Muslims were not two communities but two nationalities, and envisaged a Muslim national state in the north of India, though he felt that this could not make for peace. In July, the Marquess of Zetland appreciated that a chain of predominantly Muslim provinces stretching across the northwest of India would be a basis of great strength and influence to the Muslims generally. In November, The Economist saw the Muslims maneuvering for an effective control of the entire Indus Basin, eastern Bengal, and a corridor between the two. With these territories in their hands, it said the Muslims would hold a large Hindu population in pawn as pledges for the safety of the scattered Muslim minority in other parts of India. In December, similar sentiments were voiced in a debate in the House of Commons when Colonel Goodman thought that the mutual suspicion of Hindus and Muslims was so deeply rooted that it would be generations before either would have any confidence in the other. Sir Alfred Knox saw no hope of the Hindus and Muslims coming into one organic whole, and Sir Henry Page Croft likened India to the whole of Europe, the Indian nation to a Russo-European nation, and the Indian mind to a Chinese-American mind. In 1932, appeared two books by Englishmen of lifelong Indian experience, both refuting the arguments of those who pleaded for the existence and future of an Indian nationalism. Sir Reginald Craddock asked that if Norway and Sweden could not keep together, if Ulster and the Irish Free State could not be got to unite, how can it be expected that the infinitely greater diversity and divergent racial elements to be found in India could be welded into one self-governing and democratic whole? John Courtman was even more dogmatic. It may be that Muslim India in the northwest and northwest is destined to become a separate Muslim state or part of a Muslim empire. In April of the same year, Sir Walter Lawrence acknowledged the existence of many great and well-defined nationalities in India and saw that the only hope of natural and healthy growth in their recognition. In August, even the Manchester Guardian, as an enthusiastic supporter of the Congress creed, realized how utterly opposed to each other were the Hindu and Muslim attitudes to life, and how useless were such remedies as Pax Britannica, education and self-government. What is there to hope for? It asks despairingly, except that in time the sense of communal allegiance may be translated into a sense of allegiance to India as a whole, and the growth of skepticism make democracy practicable. In February 1933, G.T. Garrett, a retired Indian civilian, foresaw as well as feared that within a short period the projected federal government would be faced with a strong separatist movement. In May, Sir Eliot Colvin, another civilian, opined that the creation of a feeling of national union between Hindus and Muslims was likely to be a matter of centuries' duration. In 1937, when the results of provincial elections had been published, economists remarked that the provinces could be divided into two simple groups, Muslim India and Congress India. And in 1938, the Times added that the differences between the Muslim and Hindu provinces were at least as great, in fact, though not informed, as those between the provinces and the states. In March 1939, Professor Rushbrook Williams realized the significance of the new Muslim opinion demanding a separate zone and said that it testified to the degree of alarm characteristic of Muslim uncertainty. Simultaneously, the Round Table recorded that a fresh impetus had been given to the movement of creating a so-called Pakistan of the Muslim provinces in the north. At the same time, Sir William Barton tried to scare the Hindus into cooperation with the idea that the alliance of North India with Afghanistan would recreate the old Muslim menace and that Britain alone stood between Hinduism and their present danger. In June, the Marquess of Zetland, the Secretary of State for India, wrote to the Viceroy of the possibility that Muslim provinces might declare that the safeguards for their community in the Federation were wholly unsatisfactory and that they were not prepared to enter the Federation. I do not see, he concluded, how we could force the governments of the Punjab or of Bengal to enter the Federation if they were determined not to do so. Thus, by 1939, partition, India had come into the realm of practical politics. In India, as we have seen, Iqbal had broadcast in 1930 the germs of what could be developed into the area of a Muslim bloc. In 1933, Rahmat Ali spoke from Cambridge and gave the world a new name to a state yet in the womb of time. In 1938-9, Latif, Sikandar Hayat and others were seriously talking of zones and regions. This shows that public opinion both in India and in Britain was by 1939 acquainted with this widening schism in the Indian body politic, and that the Lahore Resolution, when it came in March 1940, could not have been such an unexpected shock as it generally made out to be. Why did the Muslims demand Pakistan, and why was the demand made in 1940? The Pakistan scheme was a proof of the desperate apprehension with which Muslims regarded the prospect of Hindu domination had the Congress formed coalitions in the provinces that the already existing vociferous tendencies might have been prevented from spending. The policy of the Muslim League in asking for a division of the country was a direct answer to the Congress policy of persisting in a unitary nationalism and in the rule of the majority. All the assumptions on which the Muslim acceptance of the 1935 constitution had been based were destroyed by the working of provincial autonomy in the Hindu provinces. The Hindu demand for a constituent assembly to draw up a constitution for all India proved the last straw. If the Hindus wanted a strong center and were not prepared to compromise on it, the Muslims did not want a center at all. If the Hindus believed in the rule of the majority, the Muslims denied that they were a minority. We are a nation apart, they proclaimed, and therefore entitled to rule ourselves. To the objection that the creation of Pakistan would not solve the minority problem, as a substantial Muslim population would still be left in India, they replied that Pakistan would not only safeguard the Muslims left behind in India, but also give self-respect to those who lived within the boundaries of Pakistan. With the adoption of the Pakistan ideal by the Muslim League in 1940, Muslim nationalism had come into its own. It had taken the Muslims 3/4 of a century finally to decide what they wanted. They had tried everything: a revolt in 1857, friendship with Britain, opposition to the Congress, extremist agitation, cooperation with the Congress, belligerent neutrality, negotiations, appeals and threats. First, as dethroned rulers, they resented the overlordship of the British. Then, as a weak minority, they sought a friendship with the governing power. Then, for a time, they made common cause with the Hindus and led the Khilafat agitation. Then, once again, their separatism came to the surface and they fought for communal safeguards. When these safeguards failed to give them the protection they needed or expected, the latent nationalism triumphed. The march of history had made a nation of a community. No longer did they eat out their heart in sullen importance, trusting in the beneficence of the British or the goodwill of the Hindus to the Congress claimed that India was a national state, that it was neither plural nor multinational. The Muslims answered with a brand new idea of a separate Muslim nationalism. It was difficult to stage a battle between a minority and a majority. The principle of democracy would ensure the victory of the big battalions, but it was possible to elevate the conflict to the plane of nationalism. India, said Jinnah, was not a national problem at all. It was an international problem and must be solved as such. The Cripps offer. The greatest victory, all the greater because the least expected of Muslim nationalism came into 1942, when the British War Cabinet accepted in principle the idea of Pakistan. The draft declaration brought by Sir Stafford Cripps to India and published on 30 March 1942 contained a provision whereby any province could stay out of the proposed Indian Union with the right of forming its own independent government. This non-accession clause was a major, if not a complete, concession to the Muslim demand for Pakistan. Though the Muslim League rejected the offer on the ground that the non-accession clause did not go far enough to produce the Pakistan of their dreams, and though Lord Haley thought that this clause was designed not with a view to creating Pakistan but to impressing on the Hindus the necessity of coming to some form of terms with the Muslims, the fact remains that within 2 years of the Lahore Resolution, the British government had officially and publicly accepted the spirit of Muslim nationalism and agreed to its political manifestation, Pakistan. This must have gratified even Jinnah, who was generally a man of incredible optimism. To the Muslims, it gave confidence and courage. If the Hindus and the British were cast in the role of enemies to be vanquished before the achievement of Pakistan was possible, one of them had surrendered or at least promised to lay down arms. Why did the British government concede the Muslim demand, though British public opinion was overwhelmingly opposed to the idea of partition and called it by such disagreeable terms as disruption, a breach in Indian unity, a barren folly, and so on? Many explanations come to mind. One is that in 1942 the British were fighting with their back to the wall and dared not alienate the Muslims who provided the flower of the Indian army. Another is that, as Lord Haley said, the concession was not meant seriously. It was aimed at threatening the Hindus into compromise with the Muslims. Still another is that the cabinet decision, which was genuine, was the result of influence exerted by a section of the Cabinet's India Committee which was sympathetic to the Muslim cause and consisted of such persons as Sir P.J. Grigg and Sir John Anderson. Churchill himself might have been favourable to the idea. Still another explanation may be that this clause was inserted to ensure that the Congress would reject the entire plan, thus providing the British with the excuse that India's largest party had turned down their generous offer made in all sincerity in the middle of a grave war. All this, however, is pure conjecture, and we must wait the real reason till official papers are made public or one of the participants in the act is guilty of a revealing indiscretion. The movement for Pakistan. One outstanding fact emerges from this uncertainty. Pakistan was now within the realm of possibility. It was no longer the dream of one stubborn leader, but the declared goal of Muslim India. It might still have been a bargaining counter, but at least people had begun to take serious notice of it. Its realization did not now depend on whether the British looked favourably on it or not. It depends solely on what military power the Muslims really possess. If they have enough to hold Pakistan against Hindu opposition, then even should the British prevent its appearing in the paper constitution, it will be established by the Muslims as soon as the British are gone. On the other hand, if they have not enough military power to hold Pakistan against Hindu opposition, even should the British get it put into the constitution, it would be swept out of existence by the Hindus when the British are gone. So the Muslims began to strengthen themselves. They could not have any military power because they were not free. But the Muslim League's organization was improved. Its publicity streamlined, its discipline tightened, and its message carried to all parts of India. Gradually, it built up its power, prestige, and popularity. Jinnah was no longer a Muslim leader. He was now the leader, the symbol of Muslim nationalism. As the League grew in stature, Jinnah gained in authority. His name was now bracketed with Gandhi, even by the Hindus. The Viceroy, conscious of Jinnah's strength and his following, now consulted him in all important matters. No longer was Gandhi the sole spokesman for India. No longer was Congress the sole repository of patriotism and nationalism. In practical terms, though without confessing it in so many words, everyone knew that within the bosom of India pulsated two nationalisms, one Muslim, the other Hindu. Some even realized that a conflict between the two was coming and would rip the continent from top to bottom. Jinnah's task of rallying the Muslims around him and strengthening the League was greatly facilitated by certain Congress miscalculations. After the failure of Tripp's mission, the Congress was frustrated. Its bid at controlling India had come to naught, leaving it impatient and bitter. The result was the disturbance of August to September 1942, which Gandhi called an open rebellion. Widespread riots ensued aimed at disorganizing the war effort. The revolt failed, but it sent all the Congress leaders to prison, thus giving Jinnah a rare opportunity of consolidating the League. He stoutly opposed the Quit India demand and considered it an attempt by the Congress to win India for the Hindus. The revolt was as much anti-Muslim as anti-British. At this time, some people charged Jinnah with being obsessed with the fear of Congress domination, but the Congress president himself has since confessed that his program was that as soon as the Japanese invaders reached Bengal and the British withdrew towards Bihar, the Congress should step in and take over the control of the country. For 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, when the Congress leadership was in prison, the Muslim League was building itself into a powerful party. An overwhelming majority of the Muslims had by now declared themselves for Pakistan, so that when Gandhi secured his release in the late summer of 1944, he saw no alternative negotiating with the Muslim League. The way to these talks had been prepared by C. Raj Gopal Acharya, a front-rank Congress leader who alone among the Hindus was advocating a rapprochement with the League on the basis of partition. He had argued in a pamphlet entitled The Way Out that the Cripps offer was a bona fide scheme and a genuine gesture, not a mere attempt at expediency or appeasement, and had made a plea for his revival, but he was ignored in the Congress circles. Later he argued with the leaders and especially Gandhi that they should accept the Pakistan proposal and try to reach some agreement with the Muslims. In furtherance of this, he had prepared a formula in July 1944 known as the CR formula after his initials, which considered the principle of Pakistan under two conditions. Partition would come after the British withdrawal and it would be contingent upon the favorable outcome of plebiscite of all inhabitants of the areas claimed by the Muslim League. The crucial Jinnah-Gandhi talks took place at Bombay in September 1944, but failed to reconcile the differences between the two leaders. The heart of the matter was that the Muslims did not trust the Hindus and refused to accept Gandhi's word that partition would be effected then when the British had departed. Jinnah wanted his Pakistan then and there before the British went and had serious doubts if the Hindus would keep their word when once India was free and Congress sat in the seat of authority. The talks failed but brought some solid advantages to the Muslims. By the simple fact of agreeing to meet Jinnah as the representative of the Muslims, the Congress had tacitly abandoned its claim to speak for all India. It now acknowledged the Muslim League as a power with which terms must be made. Further, the sharpness and depth of the differences between the two peoples were revealed. No longer could the Congress take shelter behind the pretense that no communal problem gnawed at India's vital parts and that all was well. Jinnah had won a clear victory by getting Gandhi to recognize Pakistan. This also gave wide publicity to his two-nation theory. Next year, another attempt at reconciliation was made, this time by the government when all political leaders were summoned to a conference at Simla by the Viceroy Lord Wavell. The idea was to discuss the formation of an executive council from amongst the Indian parties in proportion which would give a balanced representation of the main communities, including equal proportion of Muslims and caste Hindus. The attempt failed because Jinnah not only wanted parity between the Muslims and the Hindus, but also insisted on the Muslim League nominating all Muslim councillors. Two significant features of the Simla conference deserve emphasis. The Congress accepted the principle of parity between Hindus and Muslims. This was a remarkable development, for it implied Hindu acquiescence in the two-nation theory. Hindus and Muslims were two separate nations coming together for the time being in the Viceroy's Council. The Muslims were not a minority to be fobbed off with a meager representation. They were a nation entitled to equality with the other nation. The Hindus, it may be, as the Congress later argued, that it agreed to parity as a political expedient, but to Muslims, as to many others, the Congress gesture conveyed the impression that at last the Hindus had accepted the existence of a separate Muslim nationalism in India. Jinnah's demand that all Muslims appointed to the council should be from among the Muslim League was in logical consistency with his claim that he represented Muslim India. The Congress rejected this claim on the ground that its acceptance would reduce it to the position of a sectarian organization representing the Hindus alone. Though, as we will see later, the Congress then did not represent more than 1 or 2% of Indian Muslims, yet it was loath to give up its appearance of speaking for all communities and creeds. Jinnah had another objection to the procedure adopted for the formation of the council. He contended that the principle of Pakistan should be recognized first, because if the League once accepted the Babel plan, the Pakistan issue will be shelved and put in cold storage indefinitely. For the Muslims, the all-important question was whether the acquisition of a few seats on the transitional council would or would not bring them any nearer to their final goal. Pakistan Jinnah did not think so, and therefore attached more importance to the ultimate solution than to the quota of councillors. And even if all Muslim councillors were his nominees, there would still be a minority of 1/3 in the entire council. For in addition to the Congress, the council would also contain the Sikhs, the Christians, the Parsis, and the scheduled castes. And all these non-Muslim minorities shared at least one common sentiment with the Hindus: independence, with unity, and not with partition. Fundamentally, therefore, the Muslims would always be in a minority. In spite of the parity, thus mere parity was not enough. When once Hindu-Muslim parity had been conceded, Jinnah raised his price. He wanted by implication a parity not between Muslims and Hindus, but between Muslims and all others put together. On the face of it, this was an absurd claim, but not really so if we remember that he was claiming to speak for a nation, not for one of the many communities. If the first premise of his argument was granted that Muslims are a nation, the conclusion followed with the certainty of truth. And there is no doubt that the clash at the Simla conference was essentially between the irreconcilable claims of two nationalism. The quarrel over the number of seats to be allotted was a sham. Battle fought over phantom issues. The real point in question was who would succeed Britain when foreign rule was gone. The issues were not really as small as they seemed. They turned fundamentally on two conflicting claims: that of Congress to be a national party representing all Indians throughout the country, irrespective of sect, and that of the Muslim League, which demands Pakistan and the government of the predominantly Muslim regions by a Muslim government. It is the difference between an India united in spite of internal divisions and partition. The Simla parleys had failed, at least in part, because both the Congress and the Muslim League had made claims about their representative standing unsupported by electoral evidence. No general election had been held since 1934 to the central legislature and since 1937 to the provincial assemblies. The balance of political power had shifted so much in 10 years that new elections were imperative. In August 1945, therefore, the Viceroy announced that elections to all legislatures would be held in the following winter. These elections were fought on the simplest conceivable programs. The Muslim League contested to vindicate two elementary points: that it represented all Indian Muslims and that Pakistan was the only solution of the Indian problem. The Congress was equally clear-headed and uncompromising. It stood for independence without partition and claimed to speak for all India, including Muslims. In short, the election was fought on the crystal clear issue of Pakistan versus Akhand Hindustan. The outcome was illuminating as well as confusing. The Muslim League won every single Muslim seat in the central legislature and 428 out of the possible 492 in the provinces. The Congress had similar success in the general constituencies. The voters had given their unmistakable verdict, and this was illuminating. But the deadlock deepened. One party had stood for united India and received strong support. The other had called for a divided India and had also received strong support. The cleavage was as deep as ever, and this was confusing. In a final effort to reconcile the irreconcilables, the British government sent a cabinet mission headed by the Secretary of State himself to India in March 1946. After a round of unfruitful conversations with politicians of all schools, the mission set forth its own scheme on 16 May. The mission planned rule out Pakistan as a practical possibility, instead suggested a loose Indian Union arranged in 3 tiers: provinces, sections, and the federal center. The mission was greatly impressed by the very genuine and keen anxiety of the Muslims lest they should find themselves subjected to a perpetual Hindu majority, and found this feeling too strong and widespread to be allayed by mere paper safeguards, yet proceeded to argue against the Pakistan plan. It would not solve the minority problem, as it would include in the Punjab and Bengal large Hindu minorities. and to divide these provinces would be contrary to the wishes and interests of a very large proportion of their populations. Transport, postal, and telegraphic systems were established on the basis of a united India, and to disintegrate them would gravely injure both parts of India. The case for a united defense was even stronger. The Indian states would also find it difficult to associate themselves with a divided India. Finally, the geographical fact that the two halves of the proposed Pakistan state were separated by hundreds of miles was an additional factor, ideas in favor of one India. Jinnah reacted sharply to these arguments and regretted that the mission had rejected Pakistan, which was the only solution of the constitutional problem. He found it even more regrettable that it had thought fit to advance commonplace and exploded arguments and to resort to special pleading couched in deplorable language, which was calculated to hurt the feelings of Muslim India. It seemed to him that this was done simply to placate the Hindus. Some of the arguments given by the mission were sound, some were not. But the important thing to remember is that the mission's plan fell short of the separate state, which had become the main plank of the Muslim League platform and had secured 85% of Muslim votes in the elections. Perhaps Cripps, the author of the plan, tended to over-rationalize problems and to underestimate emotional forces. In this, he had much in common with the Congress leaders. The strength of Muslim nationalism was grossly underrated by both. Because Pakistan was logically indefensible, therefore the Muslim demand for it was not irresistible. It is not a part of our story to narrate the complicated and bewildering events of 1946 to 7, when each of the parties first accepted, then rejected, then again accepted the mission plan. Suffice it to say that the plan failed either to win honest acceptance in India or to solve the constitutional problem to the satisfaction of anyone. With the coming of the year 1947, the turn of events reached a new tempo. In April and May, the new Viceroy Lord Mountbatten seemed to have come to the conclusion that the partition was unavoidable. Widespread Hindu-Muslim fighting, the Congress League rift within the rickety interim government, Hindu claims about the sovereignty of the Constituent Assembly, and Muslim insistence on Pakistan combined to persuade him on the necessity of surgical operation. Towards the end of May, he conveyed to the British government his opinion that some form of division was inevitable. Whitehall at once concurred. The partition plan was finally made public on 3 June and was immediately accepted by all parties. The British government had now recognized the inevitability of partition. The Hindus were ready to accept it under protest. The Muslims were not displeased, though they did not like the consequent operation, by which the two major provinces, Punjab and Bengal, were divided. The Sikhs were resolutely opposed to the creation of Pakistan, but found it politically wise to acquiesce.